Just 2 months after Booster 18's testing failure, SpaceX's Massey test site has claimed yet another hardware failure of Starship version 3. And just because this is a test tank doesn't mean it can't have a big impact on Starship Flight 12. So what will this mean for the upcoming flight of Starship and the debut of version 3? According to the chief engineer, maybe not too long a wait. But we all know what Elon time is like. It's not all doom and gloom though. SpaceX is still making great progress on Pad 2. They're beginning the foundation work on Pad 1's updated design and building up the large air separation unit that will produce Starship's fuel on site. From Starbase in Texas to the Space Coast of Florida, work on the Starship program is in full swing in this Starship update, sponsored by Incogni. We're starting things off this week with the anomaly that occurred on Tuesday night at the Massey's test site with the test tank booster 18.3. B-18.3 is a test tank that SpaceX built to test their new integrated hot stage ring, which will be flying on version 3 of Super Heavy. For version 1 of version 2, the last generation of the booster, the hot stage ring was a separate ring with holes cut out, which was then installed between the booster and ship to allow the ship to ignite its engines without needing to shut down the engines on the booster, making the staging of the two vehicles more efficient. But after each ascent, the hot stage ring would have to be jettisoned after the booster completed its boost back burn, making the hot staging ring expendable, which doesn't really work for a vehicle with fully reusable aspirations. To make it reusable, SpaceX took the lessons learned over the last 10 flights and began to redesign the hot stage ring to be an integrated part of the booster. Ahead of Starship's next flight, which will be debuting this new design, SpaceX built a test tank that simulates the top of the booster in order to test the new forward dome and hot staging truss design. This test tank consists of a barrel section with a common dome and a booster forward dome section with the hot stage truss. In addition, a few weeks ago, they installed a ship skirt representing the bottom two rings of a ship, as if the ship was sitting on top of the booster. This setup is similar to the one that SpaceX used back in 2023 to test the original hot staging ring, so this was not a major surprise. It is worth noting that this test tank had already been tested several times previously without the ship skirt on top and in the can crusher configuration. SpaceX carried out 8 tests on this tank at Massey's before the ship skirt was installed, while there had been only one test, carried out last week on the 16th of January, that included the ship skirt and the can crusher cap on top. The test this past Tuesday, the 20th, began like all of the previous ones with the loading of liquid nitrogen, and it remained fully frosty for about 30 minutes or so. The frost then began to recede, signalling that detanking was underway and that the test was nearing its end. However, near the end of detanking, a failure occurred below the common dome, opening a tear in the steel wall and breaking several of the stringers that reinforce this common dome weld. This is a rather unusual location for a failure during testing if the primary focus of the test is the hot stage ring above. While failures during structural testing are not uncommon, if there were any part of this test tank you would expect to fail first, it would most likely be the new hardware at the top, rather than a section that has remained largely unchanged. Because of this, it is probably not straightforward to conclude that this failure was caused by something that specifically changed between versions, which makes it a more unusual failure than normal. It is also unclear whether this occurred while an active load was being applied to the tank, given that it happened during detanking operations and that this was only the second test in the can crusher configuration. It could equally have been a test stand issue, a procedural problem, or any number of potential causes. There is some bad news, however, in that qualification testing of this tank is now paused, if not potentially complete. On the other hand, there is also good news, as SpaceX still has options to continue testing the new hot staging truss design and forward dome. The failure occurred in the barrel section below the new section that needs to be qualified, which means that, in theory, they could remove that barrel, take a similar one from the Star Factory, weld it beneath the B-18.3 forward dome barrel, and then resume testing. This would still delay the qualification campaign, but it would likely be the fastest way to restart it. Any impact this may have on Flight 12 will depend on whether SpaceX obtains sufficient data from B-18.3 before the failure to be comfortable proceeding, whether they can resume testing in time ahead of Flight 12 using a repaired B-18.3 or a later test tank, or whether they decide that even if additional testing takes place later, they could still proceed with Flight 12 as planned. Right now, we're going to proceed with this video just after a word from this week's sponsor.
So we all know there's pieces of Starship scattered across Starbase and the Turks and Caicos after some of their recent failures. There's probably hundreds, if not thousands of pieces that still haven't been found. Well, guess what? Your online data is just like pieces of Starship, in places you never thought it could be. Well, we may not be able to clean up all of Starship's debris, but you can clean up your online presence with today's video sponsor, Incogni. Incogni searches the web across multiple sites looking for your data and helps you remove it. That could be online directories, people searching sites, so many others. I mean, some companies nowadays will just go ahead and sell your data, and the next thing you know, pow! Your home address and phone number are on sites that anybody can look up. That's where Incogni is a game changer. All you have to do is create an account, authorize Incogni to remove your data, and voila, they take care of the rest. Their automated service removes you from hundreds of data brokers. But now, you can even go a step further. And with custom removals, you can get your info cleared from news portals, health apps, and more. Remember, they can't harm you if they can't find you, so take your personal data back. Go to incogni.com/spaceflight or use code SPACEFLIGHT at the link in the description and get 60% off an annual plan. Thanks again to Incogni for sponsoring this video.
As we have talked about many times in recent episodes, there is a whole family of test tanks that we are keeping a close eye on because they could impact the timeline towards Flight 12. B18.3 is not the only version 3 test tank, and it is not the only one that has experienced failures during testing. Another tank, B18.1, which represents the engine section of the booster, also suffered a test failure back in September and was subsequently repaired. This booster test tank is installed in a much larger structural test stand, which SpaceX nicknames the Super Crusher. This structural test stand not only applies loads to the structure using another can crusher cap, but also has rams at the bottom which apply loads to the aft of the tank, simulating the forces of the Raptor engines. Following the failure in September and the subsequent repairs, SpaceX resumed testing of this tank in December, and this continued through January. Last week, on the 15th, it carried out its 16th and possibly final cryogenic test. It is worth noting that this test tank is particularly significant because it is not only a representation of a booster engine section, but also contains an internal section of the new fuel transfer tube that runs through the center of version 3 boosters. Yes, the one that is effectively like a Falcon 9 booster inside a Super Heavy. Because of this, the Super Crusher stand was fitted with pushers to apply loads to the booster transfer tube section housed inside. The reason we now believe the test on the 15th may have been the final one is that these pushers are now being removed, which likely indicates they will no longer be used. So, despite the failure in September, this hopefully means that the new version 3 booster aft design, along with the internal transfer tube, has now been successfully qualified. In the meantime, at Massey's, there is also another test tank, S39.1, which represents the aft section of a version 3 ship. The main change here, of course, is that it will be fitted with the much more powerful and simplified Raptor 3. The test tank is currently located at the ship cryogenic station, sitting on the thrust simulator stand where hydraulic pushers act against the aft, simulating the forces of the Raptor engines on the ship during flight. It was rolled out to Massey's just a couple of weeks ago after undergoing modifications at the Star Factory, and testing has continued ever since. This past week we've seen a few more tests of Ship 39.1, which now has a total of 7 tests completed. So now that we are up to date on the status of the test tanks for Block 3, it begs the question, when will Booster 19 and Ship 39 start their test campaign for Flight 12? We've been wondering that for a few weeks at this point. Last week we mentioned that the booster thrust simulator stand had rolled back from Massey's to the production site, which suggested we could be close to the start of Booster 19's own test campaign. However, ever since it was rolled back, it has not gone into Mega Bay 1 to collect the booster, and everything is much the same as it was last week. Believe me, we keep refreshing the road closure page on the City of Starbase's website, and so far there are no transport closures coming up for anything that would be going from the production site to Massey's. In the case of Ship 39, it is a different story. Since the S39.1 test tank is still at Massey's occupying the ship thrust simulator stand, Ship 39 is still waiting for the stand to be freed so that it can use it as well. We mentioned last week the potential scenario in which SpaceX could try to use the refurbished static fire stand and conduct part of the cryogenic proof testing of Ship 39 at the static fire stand area at Massey's. However, in the week since, there has been no visible progress towards such a scenario, so it is becoming increasingly unlikely. The reason we are so keenly awaiting these vehicles to move into their cryogenic proof test campaigns is not simply for the sake of it. The sooner they enter pre-launch testing, the sooner SpaceX can proceed towards a launch. Elon mentioned just a few days ago a potential timeframe for Flight 12, saying, quote, "Starship launch in 6 weeks." Doing a bit of maths, that places us in the week of the 9th of March. This means that over the next 6 weeks, S39.1 has to complete its testing so that Ship 39 can use the thrust simulator stand and head out to Massey's for cryogenic proof testing. Booster 19 will also need to be installed on the corresponding booster thrust simulator stand and transported to Massey's for its own cryogenic proof testing. After each vehicle completes that round of cryogenic testing, they will have to return to their respective megabays to receive engines, after which they will have to head out again for static fire testing, to Massey's for the ship and to Pad 2 for the booster. Finally, once the engine test campaign is complete, both vehicles will need to return to the bays for final checks and launch preparations, roll out to the pad, and be stacked. There is also the possibility that they may need to carry out full stack testing, given that this is an entirely new pad and a completely new Starship stack with new plumbing throughout. This is a great deal to achieve in 6 weeks, so I would not be at all surprised if this slips slightly to the right. However, it could explain why so much time has been taken with Booster 19 and Ship 39 up to this point. The more that can be prepared now, the less that will need to be done later on, which could in turn lead to a much shorter pre-launch test campaign. There is also the issue that the road to Massey's is currently undergoing works. Over the past few weeks, SpaceX has been opening up the ground and laying services along the access road to the test site. This has sometimes forced the team to close up the groundworks in a hurry to allow test tanks and other rollouts to pass through the work area, something we saw recently with the S39.1 tank. This past week, they moved on to paving the road, so hopefully that means the work is now complete and S39.1 can move out of the way, allowing the ship thrust simulator stand to return to the production site for Ship 39 to use. Apart from that groundwork, SpaceX has also continued to work on the hardware at Massey's for that static fire test area, which at some point should host Ship 39's engine test campaign. The truss structure continues to receive more sections, and out at the Sanchez lot, we can now see that the second new static fire stand has been structurally assembled. While we're still waiting for Ship 39 to head out for cryogenic testing, at least this week the vehicle received its aft aerodynamic flaps. This should complete the installation of all major components on Ship 39, except for the engines of course. If everything lines up just right, we could still have a chance of a Starship launch before spring, so if you would like to stay up to date with all the upcoming activities, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and tune in to our dedicated live streams for vehicle rollouts and tests. While we await Starship Flight 12, SpaceX is not wasting any time with the construction of Starship launch pads. In last week's episode, we mentioned how demolition work at Starbase's Pad 1 was largely complete and that it was time to start building. And SpaceX delivered. Earlier this week, the continuous flight auguring drill rig that had been installing foundation piles over at the tank farm moved to the Pad 1 launch mount area and began drilling the piles for what will become the new flame trench and launch mount at that pad. This foundation will support the massive structure that will eventually sit here, taking into account not only the launch mount, but also the pipework, the flame trench walls, the water-cooled flame diverter, and a great deal more hardware that will be installed over the coming months. And come to think of it, I am sure many of you might be wondering when Pad 1 will come back online now that work on the foundations has begun. Well, there are ways we can estimate how long it may take for SpaceX to bring Pad 1 back into service with the new design. SpaceX has already almost completed a pad with this new design, Starbase Pad 2, and there is another one already under construction at Launch Complex 39A in Florida. However, the work at Pad 1 is probably closer to what we are seeing at 39A in Florida than to what we're seeing at Pad 2. That is because at Pad 2, everything had to be built from scratch, whereas at LC-39A, SpaceX already had a tower to work with that was built back in 2022. Along the same lines, Pad 1 already has a tower in place, and in fact, work has been ongoing almost continuously since the last Starship flight in order to upgrade and improve it. Some time ago, we saw work to shorten the chopsticks, and more recently, the propellant lines that run up the tower to the ship quick disconnect arm have been removed. Scaffolding has been erected at various levels, and from time to time we see grinding and welding taking place inside the tower, likely to carry out much needed long-term maintenance and upgrades. That thing has been bearing the brunt of the salty Gulf air for God knows how many years at this point. Lately, work has also been focusing on Tower 1's ship quick disconnect arm, which is of course of the older design. Both the Pad 2 and LC-39A towers received ship quick disconnect arms that are broadly similar in basic structure, but quite different in aspects such as where the propellant lines run through the arm and how access is provided to the various components and hardware within it. It is not yet known whether SpaceX will simply strip down the current arm and modify it to match the new design, design, as was done, for example, with the LC-39A arm, or whether an entirely new ship quick disconnect arm will eventually be built. Even if they decide to retain the current arm with modifications, it is very likely that it will still need to be removed from the tower in the future, as the arm will have to sit lower on the tower than it does now. We have pointed this out several times, but it is probably worth mentioning again. Despite Starship increasing in length on version 3, the position of the ship quick disconnect port is actually lower relative to the tower because the new launch mount and flame trench design force the stack to sit lower in relation to the tower. When the time comes for SpaceX to move to version 4, which will involve a much greater stretch, they can always return the arm to its previous higher position on the tower. Taking all of this work into account, there is certainly a great deal to keep an eye on when it comes to the construction of Pad 1. SpaceX began work on the flame trench and launch mount foundations for 39A back in January of last year, and by now it has a launch mount installed, the ship quick disconnect arm attached to the tower, and a great deal more in place. At the same time, 39A appears to be about 5 to 6 months behind Pad 2 in terms of readiness, which suggests it may be around a year and a half before Pad 1 eventually looks like Pad 2 does today, essentially close to completion. Whatever the precise timelines turn out to be, one thing is certain: it is going to be very busy. Of course, just because they are starting foundation work at Pad 1, it doesn't mean that Pad 2 is complete or abandoned. This past week, we have seen continued work connecting all the lines between the ship quick disconnect arm on Tower 2 and the tower itself. Teams have also been testing the pad's water system, first by carrying out tests of the launch mount's detonation suppression system, and then by flowing water through the flame diverter itself. We had already seen deluge testing a few weeks ago, but it seems there was still more to complete. We are also still waiting for teams to clear the top deck of the launch mount, as that is something that will need to happen before they proceed with testing of the top deck deluge system. Right across the road from the launch site is the brand new air separation unit area, where SpaceX's LR-11000 has finally been reconfigured and is active once again. Alongside it, SpaceX has also brought in a smaller LR-1500 crane to help with building out the site. Over the past week, large sections of equipment for the air separation unit have been rolled out to the area and are being assembled as we speak with the help of the LR-11000 crane. SpaceX has also brought in 2 new tanks all the way from McGregor, which will be needed during air processing. They almost look like giant beer kegs, but trust me, they will not have beer in them once everything is up and running. Thanks to this plant, SpaceX will be able to collect air and separate out the 3 most common gases in dry air: nitrogen, oxygen, and argon, and use them for Starship operations. Nitrogen is used for tank farm conditioning and subcooling, oxygen is used on Starship as a propellant, making up 78% of Starship's propellant by mass, and argon is often used for welding, but who knows, perhaps SpaceX may even start using their own argon as a propellant for Starlink satellites. This week, we not only saw components of the air separation unit being transported along Highway 4, but also several new cryogenic tanks that were moved all the way to the launch site. These have not yet been installed and have simply been parked there for the time being, but it shows that SpaceX is preparing to expand the tank farm even further. Over on the Florida Space Coast, SpaceX has continued work on the Starship launch pad at LC-39A. Among the visible activity this week, we have spotted additional booster hold-down arms being installed on the launch mount, along with more deluge pipes being transported past NASA's Vehicle Assembly Building for installation at the launch site. Over at Roberts Road, Julia once again brought us the weekly update on Gigabay construction from across the Indian River. As we can now see, teams have completely progressed to level 4 across the entire western side of the building and have made further progress on level 3 on the eastern side, which is running slightly behind. Over at the Starbase Gigabay, teams have continued installing sections of the front and rear of the 3rd level of the Gigabay. They have also installed what appeared to be temporary beams running across the transfer aisles, which are likely intended to help with the structure's stability while it is under construction. The reason we believe these are temporary is because if they were to remain in place while actual vehicles were being built, it would just physically not even be possible to roll a ship down that transfer aisle and out to Highway 4. For now though, actual vehicles only roll down to Highway 4 from the Mega Bay, and there is a large amount of flight hardware waiting to be stacked inside the Star Factory. The next ship in line after Ship 39 is of course Ship 40, and we can still see its nose cone through the Star Factory glass windows. Following all the heat shield tile drilling we have observed over the past few weeks, Ship 40 was finally freed from its scaffolding this past week. As it is already stacked on its payload bay section, the hope is that now there is no scaffolding around it, it may finally be ready to move over to Mega Bay 2 and continue stacking with the rest of its barrels. tiles. Inside the staff factory, we have also spotted Ship 41's nose cone free of scaffolding, and it has been moved between workstations over the past week or so. At one point, as it was being lifted from one workstation to another, we were able to observe the move through one of our robotic live cameras. Interestingly, we noticed that it was leaving behind its composite overwrap pressure vessels, also known as COPVs, on the workstation. These COPVs are located in the payload bay area, with some positioned around the header tanks on the nose cone itself and others slightly further down next to the PEZ dispenser. These in particular are the ones in the nose cone, of course. The fact that these were previously installed inside Ship 41's nose cone and were then left behind could indicate that SpaceX intends either to change them or take a closer look at them before proceeding any further. The fact that these COPVs were no longer there several hours later is also not a particularly encouraging sign. Thanks to our robotic live cameras, we were also able to spot work on Ship 45. The ship has been enclosed within a new set of tooling that was installed inside the building a few months ago, and it looks like it's being used as a test article to train these new robotic arms. We believe these robotic arms are likely to be used in the future to automate the process of installing the pins used for the heat shield tiles. There were no actual pins being installed on Ship 45, but the overall procedure suggests that this particular robotic arm will be used for that purpose in the future. It is important for this process to become fully automated, not only because it reduces the number of work hours required from employees who could be allocated elsewhere, but also because it enables a repeatable process with much greater precision. I don't think anybody would disagree with the fact that SpaceX has had a little bit of trouble keeping tiles in place, and we've seen them testing this many times before during flight. Having their pins correctly placed and aligned will certainly help, but it also helps to actually fly and gather data on this, and unfortunately, Starship isn't really flying right now. However, it seems SpaceX may have decided to stop waiting for the next flight to test the tile attachments. This past Sunday, during the launch of Starlink Group 1720 out of Vandenberg, we couldn't help but notice a white patch with black spots on the side of Falcon 9's fairing. These look very much like Starship's tiles, and the white resembles the felt that's normally used as backing material for the tiles on Starship. What could possibly be the purpose of carrying these on a Falcon 9 fairing? Well, it's definitely not for thermal loads, because Falcon 9 fairings don't experience the same amount of heating as Starship, nowhere near it. But the Falcon 9 fairing does ascend at similar speeds to the ship, which means it could be exposed to similar aerodynamic loads and therefore simulate what would happen to the tiles as the ship goes uphill. This theory gains weight when you compare the ascent profile of Falcon 9 on this latest Starlink mission out of Vandenberg with the previous one, which was also to the same orbital shell. On this latest mission, Falcon 9 did not perform its traditional post-liftoff roll and instead went downrange with the fairing half, with the heat shield tiles facing the wind, during ascent. In fact, the fairing half not only had a patch of tiles on the side facing the camera, but also another set on the opposite side, allowing them to test tiles on each side facing the wind. Now, you might think this is the only time they've tested something like this, but we have eyes at SpaceX's McGregor test site, not only thanks to our 24/7 livestream, but also thanks to our friends and partners such as Gary Blair. In his most recent flyover earlier this month, he spotted an interesting test area at SpaceX's facility. Here we can see what appears to be a patch of tiles with their white felt backing all installed on a curved surface. In front there's a protective barrier, and directly opposite a tube with a wide nozzle that looks rather like the end of a trumpet. Following the tube down the back, we can also see that it's connected to what appears to be a small turbo pump, very similar to those used in the Starbase Pad 2 deluge system. This setup closely resembles what we saw with Falcon 9's fairing, where they may be blowing air at high speed and at a certain angle against heat shield tiles to verify if they stay in place. In that test area at McGregor, there are cameras and lights focused on the heat shield tiles, so it's clear those are the main focus of testing. With all this testing underway, SpaceX will hopefully learn more about how to keep the tiles firmly in place. They'd better if they want to rapidly reuse ships in the future. But of course, that'll be something to cover in a future episode, although here's hoping that's sooner rather than later. Thanks again to Incogni for sponsoring this video. Remember, you can go to incogni.com/spaceflight or use code SPACEFLIGHT at the link in the description to get 60% off your annual plan. I've been Ryan Caton for NSF, thanks for watching, and goodbye.